Good morning, everybody. I had no idea I was going to have high-impact entrance music. This is great. So welcome to the final morning of the London MCM Comic Con. We have, frankly, an amazing panel for you this morning. I'm shivering a little bit. As you mentioned, I'm Chris Conroy. I'm an editor at DC Comics. I edit Detective Comics, which includes coming up this March. We have the beginning of the celebration of the 80th anniversary of Batman. Which means that I will be editing Detective Comics number 1000 in March. No pressure whatsoever. But we have kind of an amazing year of events centering around Batman coming up, and this panel is actually a pretty amazing informal kickoff to that with this lineup of talent who've told some of the most memorable Batman stories of all time, honestly. So I'm going to bring them all out one by one. I've got some questions for all of them. I've got questions about their various projects. So we'll start off. First up is the recent writer of Harley Quinn, which is Jimmy Palmiotti. Hey, you look, the music is great, right? Everybody should give like a little dance, show a move as they come out. We also have the artist of several classic Batman stories with the writer Jeff Loeb, who's artist Tim Sale. We have the artist of the kickoff of Grant Morrison's Batman and Robin, Frank Quitely. The recent artist of All-Star Batman with Scott Snyder. The artist of the one, not Scott, sorry. And also the artist of Dark Knight Returns, The Last Crusade, John Romita Jr. The artist of Batman and Son and the artist of the recent DK3, Andy Kubert. The writer of Joker, Batman Damned, and co-writer of DK3, Brian Azzarello. The celebrated artist and inker, including on The Dark Knight Returns and DK3, Klaus Janson. And finally, the quite honestly legendary writer and artist of The Dark Knight Returns, Dark Knight Strikes Again, DK3, writer of Batman Year One, Mr. Frank Miller.
Hello there.
So I've got some specific questions about the projects all of you have worked on at some point or another, but before that, I would just love to kind of go down the row and collect some memories about what's the first time you encountered Batman? What was your first memorable, oh yeah, this guy experience with that character? We can start with Jimmy on the end.
I would probably say when I was a kid, watching Batman TV show, and then going out and buying my first Batman Halloween costume was pretty much it. The plastic kind where you would it would smell after like 10 minutes in the mask. Yeah, it was horrible. Although it's just insane. Yeah, but that's
Horrible
my first thing. I mean, it wasn't comics until I actually discovered my older brother's comics, and then I found Batman comics. But it was definitely the TV show that got me sold on Batman.
Tim?
Well, it's the same with me. And my costume, my mother made.
Oh, awesome.
Well,
Yeah, I have a
you
bad
didn't see
mother?
it.
Is that
You
what you're
didn't see
saying? I have
it.
a bad mother?
No,
Okay.
but this was definitely embarrassing. It was like bloomer shorts and stuff like stuff like that. But later on, I guess it was Neil Adams was my first real connection in comics to him. I was more a Marvel guy growing up. So. Who?
Mine was a Super Friends album, one of the British reprints from mid-70s, and then the TV show.
Bruno's Barbershop in Brooklyn. I'm sitting at a chair with my neck covered by a big sheet to get my head buzzed, and there's a Batman comic on the floor, along with a Superman comic with no covers. So I started reading. I couldn't read very well, but I picked it up and looked through it. And there was also a Metal Man. For some reason, there was DC all over the floor of the barbershop. And I started looking through a comic. That was the first time I ever saw a comic book. I was maybe 5 or 6. And then it's when I started asking questions. And I've always wanted to work on Metal Men because of that barbershop. Thank God for Bruno.
Wherever you are, Bruno, thank you.
Wherever Bruno is. Gotta look down.
Andy?
Oh, sorry. Oh, that's okay. Had to be the TV show for the most part, and then pretty much Neil Adams' Batman. Before that, yeah. No Brunos.
Yeah, it was the opening of the TV show, which I thought was really cool, and I didn't feel the same about the TV show.
Never watched it all the way.
I did, but it was like kind of dorky.
For me, I think it was reading Batman as a kid in school and getting caught. So that scarred me for life. And I always remember Batman and connected to that being, reading Batman instead of
and guilt.
pornography or whatever. What?
And guilt.
And guilt, right.
Batman hunts criminals. Did you fear that he would be coming for you for this transgression?
Well, I had to deal with the nuns, so that was a whole different thing.
Frank promised the nuns would come up.
You mean the penguins?
Frank, do you remember the first Batman comic or product you saw?
Yes, I was a little boy, and I'd been reading Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, and I picked up a DC Comics 80-page giant, which felt like it was as thick as an encyclopedia, and it reprinted old newspaper strips of Batman, telling a story of Batman being begged for by someone who is facing execution on death row in the electric chair, who called out for Batman to come and prove he was innocent. And Batman in these newspaper strips took the guy's case, went out, went through all the evidence in the world, and it sure looked like he'd found this guy was innocent, but he kept checking and found that he was guilty. And so the end of this wonderful story, Batman is watching the guy fry. And I went, this is my man.
So it's an incredible opportunity to have so much of the creative team behind The Dark Knight here, so I would love to dive in with a few questions about that whole trilogy, if you don't mind, starting with Frank and Klaus. I would love for you guys to kind of take me back to the months when you were working on Dark Knight, before it even came out. I mean, a lot of the lineup here has all commented on the TV show being their kind of first formative experience of Batman. What were you guys thinking in the days before it came out about how you thought Dark Knight would be received? Did you think it would explode, or were you like, I don't know how they're gonna feel about this? What was your read?
Yeah, my first thought about, I mean, once Dick Giordano who started, by the way, Dick Giordano was a renowned editor, artist, and teacher. And he got a great many things happening during that exciting time at DC Comics when he and Jeanette Kahn were shaking the place up. And he came to me when I'd been working on Marvel's Daredevil and said that he goes to the comic book convention and he said every time they check, they ask the fans who their favorite character is, they name Batman. He said, but we can't sell the comic. Do you have any ideas? That was kind of like being offered the keys to the Magic Kingdom. So I said, yeah, I got some ideas. And coincidentally, I was 29, about to turn 30, which was a terrifying age to turn. And so I thought it'd make Batman the impossibly old age of 50. And built the story essentially around that and placing Batman in a world that resembled the one that was right outside my door. It was in the 80s. It was New York City, and that was a very ugly time in New York. And so I simply threw him into that world. Originally, I had planned for it not to include Superman or the rest of the superhero cast. And I'd actually planned for it to end with Batman dying in a blaze of police gunfire. But it ran away with itself.
You know, for me, it was, I was doing some work at DC at the time, and Dick Giordano, who was the editor-in-chief, as Frank mentioned, was my mentor. And I remember walking through the hallways of DC, and Dick coming up to me, and he was all smiling, which was his style. He was a very, very friendly, yeah, absolutely, very friendly guy. And he just walked up to me and he said, you know, Frank is doing a Batman project. Do you want to ink it? And honestly, it took about 3 or 4 seconds, and I didn't know anything about it, and I just said yes, because I had worked with Frank on Daredevil, of course. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, Chris is talking about, did we know that this was going to be as big as it was or is? And I had no idea. And I don't know if, Frank, if you had any expectation, because, I mean, it's been 35 years, so no one can really anticipate that. So in terms of thinking, you know, how long this was going to last, I had no idea, none whatsoever.
That's not the way you think about these things. Mostly what I was thinking about was, are they going to allow me to do this? You know, it accelerated. It took on its own, you know, a real life of its own, and you know, as it developed, the character of Batman became defined as much more extreme than he had been in the past, and it became what it often is with these old characters, a very healthy test of wills and ideas between people with my job and the people with the job of protecting their trademarks. So there was much lively discussion.
You know, if I can say, you know, one of the interesting things about working on Dark Knight Returns was that it was a very organic process for Frank. And there were times when I would get pages that felt, you're laughing already, that there were, it was like an accordion, because Frank would cut panels out and repaste them and reorganize them. So it wasn't a thing that was a corporate sponsored project. It was a very much of an organic process for Frank, which was great to be able to be part of that.
But Klaus, unfortunately, had to be working on pages that were taped from the back, and I'm sure captured every single finger smudge imaginable.
It's interesting that you mentioned the complexity of the pages, because as an editor, I have to ask kind of one deep-cut craft question, which is a lot of people talk a lot about Watchmen being built on the 9-panel grid, and they're like, oh, the 9-panel grid, the craft. You built Dark Knight Returns on a 16-panel grid, and I was curious, why you made such a kind of ambitious choice for that much density of story.
I chose the 16-panel grid because I didn't want you to notice the grid that much, and I wanted it to be as flexible as possible. So I could break it into 4 horizontal images. I could break it into 2 vertical ones, or simply use one full-page shot. and I wanted to see if I could make a modular comic book that way. Ultimately, it's an idea that I explored and used. It helped me develop my thinking, and it's not one that I use particularly anymore. It's very useful, but yeah, it was there as a way of trying to systematize how to lay out comic book pages at a time when everything seemed to be pretty haphazard, and to bringing some sort of structure into comics was something a lot of us were thinking about, much as Dave Gibbons did with Watchmen.
So turning to the most recent chapter of the Dark Knight trilogy, DK3, Brian and Andy and John, you all contributed to this, but Dark Knight was something that you read as fans or very early in your career. When it came time to think about working on a project like this, how did you approach it? How did you kind of go back into that material? And
Tried not to screw it up. Staring at a blank page when you're just first starting out, for me, was probably one of the most daunting things I had ever done in my career. It was pretty rough, to go through, as you can imagine. I don't know about you, John, but it was tough.
Yeah, but I have to follow you, you pain in the ass.
Oh, you should hear the.
And I had to follow him.
You should hear these guys when they're not lying to a crowd. I mean, they were talking about just how like I don't know, they lined their kitchens with pages from Dark Knight, with original artwork from Dark Knight. and mostly Andy just told me how bad the anatomy is.
Yeah.
I cry a lot. I cry a lot when I talk with these guys.
Listen, working with Brian and Frank on The Last Crusade was not as daunting as looking at the work that he was putting out, that he and Klaus were putting out. I was actually more comfortable getting the plotting from Brian and Frank. It just kind of allowed me to play. And as long as I didn't pay attention to what had already been out, you get intimidated. I'm sorry, I get intimidated when I see beautiful work being done on the same character. It's going to be out a month before my stuff comes out. So after I'd stopped throwing rocks at his picture, I got myself in order. But Frank and Brian gave me just so much room to play and then to do it without having it inked, which is a little bit intimidating. Peter Steigerwald painted it, basically, and it gave us a chance to look different. Frank was going to ink it, and then it worked out we couldn't do that, and it ended up being a nice combination of something different and their brilliant story. It was easier for me than I thought. But the physical part of doing just full pencils and tight was a little bit labor-intensive.
Didn't Frank ink some of the pages?
Yeah, the first couple of pages, I think he tried. And,
Yeah, because...
and he hated my guts after that, and then he'd...
Oh, he did. No, but I happened to see them in Frank's studio.
No, I hated you guys before that, but that had nothing to do with artwork.
Well, no, he did ink the Green Lantern story.
Yes, the Green Lanterns. I forgot the
the
12
mini.
page. Yes. Yes, that was fun. I got a lot of phone calls from Frank, and they were just, none of them were great job. It was all you pain in the ass kind of thing. I don't want to ink you ever again, and you suck, and all that.
so John, you are actually, of the people on this stage, you are actually the most recent to arrive on Batman. I think you did have that Batman Punisher one-shot back in the distant past.
That was
but
95?
Something
Yeah,
like
I was,
that.
3 or 4 years old at the time.
Yeah, that checks out. But to really have kind of put down a run on Batman at this point in your career, I'm curious what that felt like.
After not knowing how great the character was, finding out how great the character was. I'd heard from guys like Jimmy, when you work on Batman, that silhouette of the character, because of the ears and the cape, it's a glorious thing. It's similar to working on on Daredevil, the horns and the single color of the image. And I didn't realize that until I got on it. And then I just start working on it and realize this is a great, great character. Possibly the greatest character in comics history. And working on Superman first, I always laughed at Superman because it was too perfect. And I got on it, and then I realized he's got a red cape. I said, I've done this before. This is not too bad. But it was completely different doing Batman, and it was a great experience. I just really had it was a revelation after working for Marvel for all those years. And not that I laughed at Superman or Batman, it's just I wasn't experienced. And getting on it, it's the greatest character. Batman's the greatest character, sorry.
There is something about him that we have all pretty much made our mark on him, you know, and others have too.
I don't know
Well,
about
I don't know. There's just something about drawing him that I don't know, just makes the best come out of you.
That could be.
You know, it really does.
I'm still working on that.
You're doing
Jimmy, speaking of kind of changing perspectives, you've just come off of a run where for several years you were looking at Batman through the eyes of somebody who hates his guts in Harley Quinn. How has that changed the way you think about Batman as a character?
Well, growing up, my favorite Batman is everybody on this panel, right? So the idea of putting Batman in Harley's perspective was he's a pain in the ass. And he gets in the way, and he ruins her fun, but at the same time, she's really curious about him, and so whenever he appeared in a Harley book, we always kind of poke fun at Batman. The idea that I think just recently I had him hanging upside down, about to die in a vat of boiling oil. And somebody says, Batman, you need help? He goes, no, I'll get out of this. You go do your thing. I'll be fine. So I've always taken a perspective of a step outside of Batman. And I recently wrote a two-parter for one of the Walmart books where I actually retold the origin. And of course, it's just, Frank's. That's all I looked at. And then I just added one little tiny thing in it because I said, all right, I want to make my mark over here. But the character is just a great character. I couldn't write Batman in a Harley book exactly because it's always, when you read a Batman book, it's his point of view. You hear his voice. And in Harley's, you hear her voice, and it's usually like 35 voices going on at once. So, and there's a lot of insanity in there. So it's always fun when the two of them meet, but definitely a lot different.
Now, Tim, we have recently released, and here's where I'm just going to do a shameless product plug. We have recently released a massive hardcover of all of the Batman work that you did with Jeff Loeb. Just tons and tons of it. If you have a Batman fan and they need a holiday present, into it. I'm curious if after all of that work, if there's a story in there, The Long Halloween everybody has talked about and debated ad nauseum, but if there's a story in there that you think maybe slipped by people that they should take another look at, that you're really proud of something you brought to it.
No, not really. Long Halloween and Dark Victory, I think of as the same thing. Dark Victory I did second, and I'd done Superman for all seasons in between. And I learned a lot doing that because it was so different than anything I'd done before. I'd had the 3 Halloween specials before Long Halloween, so that was just momentum there. But Dark Victory looks different to me, looks better to me, just the art part of it. And so people talk about it less than, Long Halloween, because that's what people saw first. And the template is the same, the mystery and everything. But no, I don't think there's anything that I would point to say was overlooked. There's certain spots that, well, actually people don't, other than that people weren't able to, they don't say this as much anymore, but when Long Halloween first came out, so many people couldn't figure out the ending. And I would just repeat what Jeff would always say, is that it's all in there, and but no, nothing. It's been a wonderful ride, and so I'm just grateful that people dig it.
When you work on Batman that long, for such a long stretch of time, and I mean, you still find yourself sketching him at these shows, et cetera, what are the kind of qualities of Batman that can help keep him alive for an artist and keep it interesting and keep it fresh?
Well, my approach to almost everything is I love exaggerating things. So, and Batman is so easy to exaggerate with the cape that sometimes is short, sometimes immensely, ridiculously long. The angst, the milieu of Gotham City, all that stuff is. I never get tired of it, really. It's the one thing I really never get tired of drawing. So I'm happy that people ask for it.
Now, Frank, you worked on the first arc of Grant Morrison's Batman and Robin, which is a very different take on the character, where I think you did start to kind of let some of the language of the TV show slip in to the portrayal. You also introduced the villain Professor Pig, who is, I think it's safe to say, he is a deep cut that is the profound favorite of everybody in DC editorial. We talk about Professor Pig at least once a day because he's insane. Did you ever think a character like that would wind up on an American network television show like Gotham when you're creating a weirdo like that?
No, of course not. Grant's a pretty good draftsman himself, and he tends to give me rough drawings of his character designs when he's introducing new characters. And there was a whole bunch of villains in that story that were based on circus freaks, the bearded lady and those three Asian guys that are joined at the shoulder blades, so they fight like a tumbling crab or whatever. And he had done pretty loose sketches for each of them, apart from Professor Pig. And I said, what's Pig to look like? And I said, oh, it's really simple. It's, you know, Rex Harrison from My Fair Lady? He said, it's just him in a butcher's apron with a pig mask. And I went, okay. And normally I draw and redraw and fine-tune until I get the thing looking the way I want it. And I did one sketch of Professor Pig and showed him, and he was like, yep, that's the guy. And that was it. And I didn't think any more of it, you know. And then he, as you say, he proved to be really popular.
At what point in the book did you decide that you wanted to try to incorporate sound effects into your art within the panels? If you haven't seen Batman and Robin, it'll be the sort of thing where when there's an explosion, in the cloud of exploding gas will be the shapes boom, boom, or if somebody gets shot, there's a spatter of blood and it spells bang. At what point in the process did you decide to add that?
It was shortly before I started, and again, it was something I used to do when I started out, and I would incorporate the sound effects into the artwork. And after a few years, so this was back in the early 90s, after a few years, I kind of thought that was sort of lame looking, and I stopped doing it. And Grant said to me, remember that thing you used to do with the sound effects? He said, would you do that again? I said, no, I don't want to do that. It doesn't really work. And he was like, no, please, I loved it. So so for those opening 3 issues, I did it just because he kind of insisted.
It is a very bright and colorful take on Batman, despite also being very disturbing at times. I'm curious if, having done that, if you still feel the itch to do like the very noir, it's all black ink kind of take on Batman, or if that feels like Batman in your heart now that you've done this.
I would dearly love to do more Batman, and I would be open to pretty much any approach to Batman. That's another of the things I think that that's great about Batman. It's the fact that he's been drawn by so many artists over the years, and he's been written by so many writers, and there's been the TV show, and there's so many different ways of doing him. I mean, like what Frank did with him and the TV show are like at opposite ends of a very, very wide spectrum, and all of these things can be Batman. I don't think you've got that much scope with Superman. Superman's basically a really powerful, really good guy, and if he's not that, he starts feeling not like Superman, whereas with Batman, you know, like, he really is open to interpretation. So
Now, because we are in front of a UK audience, I want to ask you about what I think was your first Batman work, which was Batman: The Scottish Connection.
Yeah.
A one-shot in, I believe, 1995. What can you tell us about that one? What do you remember about that book?
I think the laugh probably told you everything you needed to know. Alan Grant told me that he had a great idea. He'd been reading some books about the origins of Freemasonry and about the relationship between the Knights Templar and Freemasons and a place in Scotland called Roslyn Chapel, which a few years later appeared in the Da Vinci Code for similar reasons. But pre-Da Vinci Code, Alan had this idea that he wanted to do a Bruce Wayne story. So Bruce is on holiday in Scotland, and he uncovers a mystery, and he solves it as Bruce Wayne. And he wrote this story that he was really proud of. And the Bat editors said, we need to have him in the costume. And he was like, it's not that kind of story. And they forced him to rewrite it with a costume. And then they forced him to rewrite it again with a bad guy. And it just went on like that. And by the time he eventually finished the script, he hated it. But he didn't tell me that because it was the first time I'd drawn Batman, so he didn't want to ruin it for me. And this was also, I'd been working in comics for like 10 years at this point, and this was the first time I'd done a character that anybody, like taxi drivers and your aunts and uncles, had actually heard of. And because everybody would say, what do you do? I draw comics. What comics do you draw? And you're like 20 Visions or Flex Mentality. It's just things that nobody had heard of. And so I gave it to my mum when it was finished. And the next time I saw her, I said, what did you think of the Batman book? And she said, well, your drawings were very good, son, but the story was rubbish. And I went straight on to the phone to Alan Grant and told him, and that's when he told me that he said, tell your mum she's right.
Now, Andy, you also worked with Grant at the beginning of the run that Frank eventually joined in Batman and Son, and I think you drew what is maybe one of the most successful character introductions in the DC universe in the last 20 years, which is Damian Wayne. Can you talk a little bit about capturing his brattiness and his energy?
Grant just described him as like this little bratty kid, and we didn't think he would actually last anywhere near as long as he has. And I think the original plan, and Grant's original plan, was to kill him off after a while. So, but I guess he got to be the character fans love to hate, and he got popular, so we kept him around. You know, I mean, I just drew him, like with Frank here. Grant's a very good draftsman himself, and had very good descriptions of what Damian would look like and act like. Described his first costume, a simple white and black costume, just like a little jumpsuit that he would be wearing. And then later on, he merged into the thing with the hood and the cape and everything like that. But yeah, you know, he just wasn't slated to be around very long, you know. But it's great to see how over the years, how other artists have interpreted him, how other writers have interpreted him, how the fans have loved him, you know, where he's ended up and everything. It's really cool.
And to kind of finish off that thread, Klaus, I believe you drew Grant's first Batman work in Gothic in 1992, I think. What do you remember of the process of that and the approach to that story?
You know, I didn't know that was his first, actually.
Other than maybe a short feature, I think
you might be right. Yeah. I thought when I got the script, I thought that I was an extremely fortunate person to be able to work on a story and on a script that was as good as it was. You know, everybody's mentioned that Grant is an artist in his own right. And so he has an amazing ability to have a visual sense. You know, there are some writers who just think in terms of words, and then there are some writers who think in terms of visuals. And Grant definitely thinks in terms of visuals. There was nothing that I added or subtracted. I think the script was just about perfect. It was, you know, it was just an absolute delight. And you know, people still come up to me these days telling me, you know, that the story scared them. I don't know if we intended for that to happen, but it was a good story. It was a great experience, and definitely one of my favorite Batman projects.
Brian, one of the characters that you come back to again and again in the Batman universe is the Joker. He's appeared in so many of your projects at this point. What do you get to do as a writer with the Joker that you can't do with any other character?
Speak from the heart.
I don't know.
From the heart.
You get to speak from the heart.
Yeah, speak from. No, that's Lex Luthor. I think, when Joker's always about unpredictability, you know. I don't know what that character does, and I don't think anybody else should either. I mean, he should be, when he comes in the room, he should terrify everybody in the room, and he should never know what he was going to do. When we did the Joker book, Lee and I, we had just done Lex Luthor, and that was from Lex's perspective, and we made the decision. It's like, well, we can't, do a Joker book where he's narrating it, because it just takes away all that character's power if you knew what's in his head.
Yeah, and I mean, because I had him narrate part of the book that Jim Lee and I did, and Batman had to take over the narration again, I found, because it was getting into a space that was, one thing is there's a danger of him losing his power, but also you're in such a crazed space that it is extremely discombobulating for the readers.
Yeah, you get in his head, you cut his balls off.
You got what?
You cut his balls off when you get in his head.
Language, please. Do you find that
That, by the way, is he just gave away the punchline of the next book he's doing with Lee.
I knew somebody would take the shot. Do you find that when you're writing him, he knocks the course of your story off where you thought it was going to go?
No.
If you haven't been to a Brian Azzarello panel before, for the record, that's his favorite answer to any question you can possibly ask him.
No, it's not.
I want to take a brief detour because he's actually come up in a couple of questions, but it comes back to Dark Knight Returns. Frank, you mentioned Superman was never going to be in that story.
No.
But once you put him in there, I think you really flipped the way Batman and Superman interact for a while.
He's right.
Now we get two words. Point being, a lot of people have drawn from that relationship that you wrote at the time that's more adversarial, more contentious. You and John are now doing a Superman project. Do you have that in mind now when you're doing your take on Superman?
Oh, Batman will have an appearance, and we'll see where it all started, and why they get along so well.
So you do consider that to be kind of a piece with the relationship that those characters had in Dark Knight?
Yeah.
It's true. We don't want to give you too much because this book is still to come. But
Yeah, no, it is. A great many things are established, because our Superman project, a lot of it is about establishing and reintroducing things. What's amazing to me, and it shows the wealth of the creation of Superman, is that it's such a wonderful creation that you can revisit it after all these generations and generations, and it's still an abundance of fresh material. I'm finding myself absolutely thrilled by it.
Well, one of the things when we started Dark Knight 3 that Frank said to me is, I need to rehabilitate what I did to Superman.
Yeah.
I will not lie, you punked him pretty hard in Dark Knight Returns.
Oh, it was much worse in Strikes Again.
Also true.
Kryptonite boxing gloves? That was bad.
John, when
Yeah,
I
but
don't
who
believe,
got the daughter?
I'm sorry?
Who got the daughter? you know. And
John, when it comes time to draw Batman in this project, which I don't believe you have, do you think you'll be looking to Frank's version, or are you looking to...
I'm still giggling about Rex Harrison with a pig mask. I can't get that image out of my head. Oh, shit.
Batman and Robin Volume 1 on shelves now.
I honestly, he made that point about how many times it's been done and how well it's been done. If you think about what's been done before you, you're probably going to brain lock and have a creativity lock. I can't think about that, honestly. If there's a deadline, I'll try to meet it. I call it deadline style, whatever comes out on time. It's intimidating, just like Superman was intimidating. And you sit down, and when the mortgage payment is due, you do your work. I can't think of it any other way.
who's inspiring your interpretation of King Tut?
Oh my God. Steve Martin.
So one thing I'd love to do, some of this has kind of already come up organically during the conversation, but I'd love to kind of go down the row and kind of collect thoughts on Batman creators or stories or works that you really love and that you don't necessarily think people look at enough. Maybe starting with Jimmy, and you're also, for the record, free to name your own work.
It wouldn't be my own. Not look at it
Yeah,
enough.
Jimmy, why don't you name your own work for the next half hour?
Boy, I have to ask, you asked the question, I have to answer it right away. That's tough. I was hoping you'd go down the line and I can think of something. Year one is the one I read all the time. Because, when I first started writing, I just said, okay, this is how it's done. This delivers every impactful moment. It's emotional. It's every character has this tragedy going on, and that book is the one that, for me, it taught me how to be a better writer, and that's the book I always go back to.
No, absolutely, me too. And Mazzucchelli too, with the changing the style from Born Again to Year One was so influential on me.
Oh, here. David Mazzucchelli's stuff is amazing.
Yeah. And obviously your work too, Frank, but and the coloring of Richmond Lewis in there, and all that was just terrific. Joker's Five-Way Revenge, maybe something like that. I don't know how many people now know that. Certainly people of my age, it was a huge influence. That's Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil. They'd done a lot of work both on Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and Batman before that, but then hadn't for a while. And it's also, it's a terrific story. It's got the Joker in it. Neil inked it himself. And I don't know how many people know that now, so I'd say that one too.
I'm afraid it's going to be pretty much the same again. For me, after the Dick Sprang stuff that I saw in my earliest years, I kind of didn't read comics other than Mad Magazine and like Sinister Tales and Weird Science and stuff like that, until I started working in underground comics, and some of the guys in the underground comics, the comic we were working on, some of them were comic fans, and so in a relatively short space of time, I saw Frank's Dark Knight, I saw Year One, and I saw a black and white collection of Neil Adams. So that was my kind of my main thing.
Could you repeat the question?
What's just sort of a Batman story that you love and look to that's kind of a touchstone?
I couldn't pick one. Not only is there so much writing brilliance around this, the art, I've kind of glossed over the stories because I read them so long ago, and I did not literally read all the dialogue in the most recent stuff. I'm a fan of the artists. That's shallow and petty, but I keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. And it is intimidating. He mentioned it before. But Frank's style, Frank and Klaus on Daredevil, and then the Batman stuff, as an artist, was very liberating because it took away in my head the requirement to be perfectly accurate and realistic. There was this great style. And then the style variance from all the artists, it really helps. And then at the same time, every difference from the height of the ears to the shape of, like he mentioned, the cape, there's so much to take in and then realize that you cannot compete. Again, you get back to just get it done and hopefully it won't suck. But there's so much input now in the internet, whereas years and years and years ago, there wasn't that much input. So you hear negative and positive. You can only do the best you can. But I look at this stuff from all of these guys and I'm in awe. Because every time I think nothing can be done that's new, these guys draw something different. And they draw something new. And I'm cheering and I'm cursing at the same time. And I hate these flipping guys. I hate it. That close.
It's interesting that you mentioned the ears because I did notice that we have.
Yeah,
really
we all hate you, John. In fact, everyone in this room hates you.
Wait a minute. I thought there was a lot of my relatives back here somewhere.
They hate you too.
I see a lot of dark-haired people with broken noses.
I love and appreciate you, John. I want you to know that.
Don't trust him.
Andy?
You're asking what Batman stories didn't get enough
Story or
attention?
art, or what sticks with you?
What
when you
sticks
think
with me?
of Batman? Yeah.
Probably pretty much everything that I like, that I see. You know, it's kind of not, it's very difficult not to have it end up in what you're doing. You can see it in Dark Knight 3. You know, I mean, the influence is evident. You know? It wasn't planned to go that way, but I couldn't see it any other way, you know? And it worked out very well. Every artist up here, and then some, that has worked on Batman creeps into me somehow. So it's very difficult to say. From Frank to Mazzucchelli, to that Frank, to this guy, to Tim, to everybody, seriously. It's hard not to have that get into your work. That's all I guess. That's it.
I don't know.
No.
Brian's turned back into himself.
You know, the one, like, I really didn't read Batman till Dark Knight.
It shows.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I know nothing about that guy.
It shows.
The Brave and the Bold with Batman and Sergeant Rock that your father did. That one.
Yeah, that was.
And I read it because it was Sergeant Rock.
Not Batman.
Not Batman. I didn't give a shit about that. I really didn't.
You like Bulldozer.
Got our pull quote for the panel, folks.
Yeah, I like that one too. That was a good one. Yeah.
You know, that, which of course you know, Andy, your dad inked one of those pages
Which would?
on the Brave and the Bold. Batman saw.
Yeah, he had to fix it.
He had to. No. But you know that, right? Your dad inked one of the pages.
Really?
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that.
And you didn't know that?
No.
No, take a look. As a matter of fact,
I'll
I
go
was
through the
reading-
files. Yeah.
What?
I'll go through the files.
Yeah, that's right. But Andy's dad said in an interview that inking Neil was like inking his own pencils. And I always thought that was interesting because, you know, they're actually not that similar.
But on that
Right.
job, Neil, and believe me, Neil Adams bows to no man. You know, he was, you know, he's the preeminent artist of a generation, and he's, you know, his stature is unquestioned, but the way he talked about Joe was like nothing else, and he, you know, his admiration of your father is really remarkable, and I mean, and of course, well deserved.
And Neil's a good friend, very good friend.
Well,
Yeah.
and absolutely well-deserved. I mean, your dad was absolutely amazing.
But I thought Neil and my father, I didn't know they collaborated on that. I thought it was the Enemy A story that my father had inked.
Also, but I take a look at the Brave and Bold. There was one page that your dad inked over Neil.
Yeah. Cool.
It was
Okay.
always fun to see that too. I have to say.
Does it stand out?
Apparently not.
You see, I was right. That's
Let me just say one thing, just as like one of these, I love these little inside bits. I was talking to David Mazzucchelli about Born Again. It was Born Again, right? And he told me that he did the entire run with no reference at all. So it just came out of his head, which completely blew me away. And I think that was his point. His point was to try and do something without any reference at all, just to have it come, spontaneously.
You mean like buildings and water towers and things?
Absolutely. Everything.
Seriously?
He looked at nothing, which was his challenge for that, for that run. I thought that was fascinating.
Great segue. You pain in the ass at the end. Frank Miller was known to climb buildings in Manhattan. Before the internet, and couldn't print anything out, you had to go find your reference. Frank climbs buildings in Manhattan, takes pictures of water tanks and rooftops, and I had to start doing that. I just want you to know I broke a toe because of you.
See, it wasn't true, but I had it spread so that John would have to get himself half killed doing that kind of stupid thing.
And Frank, before you did Dark Knight, as far as Batman, would you say Neil was it?
Oh, Neil was the man. I mean, when Neil was in fact he's a fascinating, one of a kind figure in comics history because there was a whole generation that never really showed up in comics because, well, for lots of reasons. But Neil was the guy who showed up, and because there's just about nobody of exactly his age bracket, no artists in comics. But he was like our heroic figure who kept the light burning, and then he opened up a advertising art agency in Manhattan called Continuity Associates, which kept wannabe comic artists alive, by providing them with maybe modest paying advertising artwork and free art lessons from the master himself. Neil's importance in comics history is largely unsung because he doesn't toot his own horn, but it is profound. Any history of comics that I'm ever involved with, he's going to be one of the major figures that actually kept our medium alive.
Let me just say that in terms of Neil, I've known Neil since I was about 18 or 19. Not that well, but mostly through Dick Giordano because Dick and Neil had a studio together. But in my later years, which I am currently in,
Boy, are you.
I agree with Frank that in spite of the recognition that Neil gets, it's still understated. He's an amazing influence on the industry and on artists. He was, in a sense, the Frank Miller of his day.
Oh. I owe you dinner. Oh, and the check, well, it got lost in the mail.
Right, I'm sure, as it usually does.
Now, we can't finish a Batman panel without talking at least a little bit about the insane and amazing number of villains that he has,
Yes.
and just that deep end. For example, talking about Neil introduced Ra's al Ghul into the mythos. Kind of going down the line, all of you have had a crack at certain villains. Is there any that you would really just love to grab again and go deep with? I mean, Jimmy, you just filled 4 years with one of Batman's villains. Is there another that you would like, I want to crack at them now?
I want to sound like Brian Azzarello and just say, no. That's a tough one for me. I've only written the Joker being abused by Harley, so it might be fun to kind of try just to.
Wait, have him abuse Harley, please, Jimmy.
Probably the Joker, though. I'd like to try my hand at, because other than I've always written him from a different perspective, and since I know Frank Thierry, I'd be able to write a good Joker, I think. So that makes sense to a couple of people up here.
Tim, you mentioned that you never get tired of drawing the Joker as well. Is he one that you could sit with?
I never get tired of drawing him. I'm not drawn to him as a character as much. It's just so much fun to draw. We were on a panel a couple days ago and talking about this sort of thing. And Brian said, well, I think you asked about why Brian always uses Killer Croc. And that started me thinking about it. And so I'll say that. And
I mean, he's an artist's dream just in terms of the texture of
Yeah.
him and the imagination, yeah.
what do you say, Brian?
The Killer Croc, covered in scales, teeth.
Oh yeah, I know Killer Croc is. Yeah.
It's a skin condition. That's when he works.
A villain I actually always found pretty entertaining was the ventriloquist. I've only ever done the Joker on covers. I've never actually done any Joker interiors, so that would be an obvious one. And I wouldn't mind doing something else with Professor Pig.
DC editorial is thrilled to hear that back home, let me tell you.
Shit, Rex Harrison with his pig mask.
You had to give that to John before we left the panel, didn't you?
Oh, I've only worked on the Joker and Two-Face with Scott Snyder, and it's the Joker, which has been done to death, was done so well by Brian and Frank, and the reference to David Bowie. Frank, what was it again? That was his what iteration with the tuxedo?
Oh, in Dark Knight, I was thinking of David Bowie when I drew his face.
At the sort of the thin white Duke phase of Bowie's career, right?
So he sent me a bunch of images of Bowie, and I used that, but that was so much fun working on the Joker that was non-Joker-like in that story. And Brian and Frank just laid it out, and it was a blast. So I have to say the Joker, which is so easy because it's been done to death, just done really well by these guys.
That's because the Joker is. I mean, that's just the thing. Is that often you can pick what is the obvious choice. The reason it's the obvious choice is it's the best one out there. I mean, there really aren't a lot of people who say, "I've got the best King Tut story you've ever heard, that you've never could have thought of. It'll chill your blood."
Is that a gauntlet? Did you just throw a gauntlet?
I expect all of you to pick this challenge up.
I think I would like to do a very grizzled, nasty, evil, and they're all evil and demented, penguin. I would love to have a run at him. Something that visually, he's not what you would imagine.
He's also a fun one because he's one of Batman's only villains who's actually just a guy, when at the end of the day, Batman is also just a guy.
True. But I would like to make
Just a guy with $1 billion and some really cool toys.
And a billion sit-ups.
But visually, you know, you have the hat, you have the cigarette holder. You could do a lot with it, and then once you reveal him out of the shadows, you have a lot of fun with it.
Brian, I've teed you up for your classic answer.
Oh, there's too many to mention. How much time do we have? I mean, I could go on and on all day about that. I want to agree with Frank here. Ventriloquist. That's a character I did in Broken City. I find him really tragic. That there's something about that, that character I'd like to maybe dive into a little bit more. Harley, I haven't done really anything with her so much, but I'd like to.
Gotta give them give Paul and Bruce credit here, because with Harley they actually dropped a new one on us, and one of the very few new additions that's come and stuck and now been accepted by everybody as part of the game.
The Joker is an amazingly fun character to draw. But I think that I was really impressed with, and correct me, Chris, on how to pronounce his name. Is it Michael Janine? Michael Janine did an amazing job on Poison Ivy a little while ago on the Tom King run. And it kind of made me want to take a crack at doing Poison Ivy. I think that what the two of them did was pretty impressive.
And Frank, clearly your answer is King Tut.
It seems so obvious now, but I think with Batman in terms of villains, you could just go female, and make it an absolute parade of some of the best and sexiest characters, because it's kind of amazing if you look at it. It shows profound differences between the two heroes, that Superman doesn't have any good female villains at all, and Batman has all of them. So it kind of tells you who the sexier character is, I guess. Matter of fact, when it comes to villains, Batman has all the good villains. Superman's got Luthor, and I guess Brainiac.
He's got Bizarro.
Wait a minute.
Bizarro's not a villain.
Wait, who's the villain? Never mind. I can't say it.
I do love that we have managed to wrap this panel with Frank slipping the knife between Superman's ribs one last time
Hey,
on the way out.
Superman's my next project, man. I love the guy.
Sure, look for it next year, everybody. Guys, I want to thank you so much for this panel and for all of your work.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure. And thank you all very much.
And don't forget, up next on our stage very soon, in fact, in just about 15 minutes' time, we'll be joined by the Shadowhunters cast